Picture this. For 3 decades, Hillary Clinton operated as the completely untouchable architect of power in Washington. We are talking about a political titan who outlasted the Kennedys, shrugged off endless subpoenas, brushed past special counsels, and walked through the relentless crosshairs of Congress without suffering a single scratch. But all of that legendary invincibility completely vanished during 40 agonizing minutes sitting directly across a wooden table from J.D. Vance. So, what was her fatal miscalculation? It was looking the Vice President of the United States dead in the eye and smugly declaring that he only used his childhood poverty for political profit. She strolled into that hearing room fully expecting a standard, predictable partisan sparring match, but what she actually walked into was an absolute psychological slaughter. You see, Vance didn't bother asking who protected her, because Kennedy had already played that exact hand. Instead, Vance unsheathed a weapon that nobody in 30 years of political warfare had ever dared to use. He forced her shielded elite reality to violently collide head-on with his own. He took the heavily guarded, multi-million-dollar gates of Chappaqua and slammed them right up against the rusted, forgotten streets of Middletown. He masterfully weaponized her husband's astronomical $750,000 corporate speaking fees against the heartbreaking image of a battered shoebox holding a grandmother's $412 life savings. He took those glittering, champagne-soaked galas and placed them right next to government-issued block cheese. And in the suffocating, agonizing silence that hung between those two vastly different Americas, in the brutal, undeniable math of that distance, 40 million viewers heard the devastating answer to a question that never even needed to be asked. Go ahead and smash that like button right now, because you are about to witness the exact jaw-dropping moment a politician worth $120 million condescends to a man raised in a poverty-stricken trailer, only to sit helplessly as he opens a single thin folder and lets cold, hard arithmetic utterly obliterate her entire legacy. The showdown kicked off precisely 8 minutes into an opening statement from Hillary Rodham Clinton that bore the flawless architecture of 30 years of practice. She demanded the committee understand the credentials of her questioner, claiming the American people deserved context. Every single sentence was load-bearing, and every clause was meticulously designed to distribute weight evenly across her structural defense. The Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, Dirksen Building, room 226, the exact same room where Kennedy had asked who made sure just 3 weeks earlier, was packed to the absolute brim. C-SPAN carried the feed live. Every major network ran a split screen, and the gallery had been at full capacity since 6 a.m. Simply because the last time Clinton sat in this room, she hadn't answered the question, and the entire country tuned back in to see if she would answer this one. Spoiler alert, she would not, though she didn't know that just yet. Right at the 9-minute mark, she pivoted away from the committee and locked eyes directly with J.D. Vance. Dripping with condescension, she listed her 30 years of public service, her travels to 112 countries as Secretary of State, her negotiations with heads of government on every continent, and her time in the Situation Room during operations too classified for the committee to even discuss. She mocked the idea of being lectured on ethics by a man who worked as a venture capitalist for Peter Thiel before discovering politics. Her tone found that specific, flat register of dismissal she reserved for men she considered far beneath her, which is honestly so much worse than the sharp register of actual combat. She smugly told Vance that he didn't grow up to serve the public, but rather grew up to write about growing up, and then a Silicon Valley billionaire made him a senator. Pointing at his desk, she noted his folder was very thin, questioning if someone who owed his career to a billionaire was the right person to interrogate a woman with 3 decades of service. The gallery section behind the Democratic staffers erupted in a sharp, practiced exhalation. They had been waiting since the Kennedy hearing for her to strike back, and they were soaking up the satisfaction of a debt being paid. However, this woman who had spent 3 decades serving the country had somehow accumulated an estimated net worth of $120 million along the way. She hadn't actually driven her own car since 1996, hadn't carried her own luggage since 1993, and currently owned 2 homes in Chappaqua, New York, valued at a combined $2.85 million. Meanwhile, her husband had raked in over $100 million in speaking fees since leaving the White House. On top of that, their foundation had hauled in over $2 billion in donations from individuals, corporations, and foreign governments, many of whom had active business before her State Department. This was fundamentally not the same Clinton who sat before Kennedy 3 weeks prior. This version had intensely studied the game tape. She had watched herself nervously reach for the water glass and miss. She had noted her orbicularis oculi muscle contract, and she had seen her neck flush vividly above the collar line, and she had fiercely corrected it all. Her hands were now pre-positioned flat and spread on the table, locked into place long before the hearing even began, and her jaw was firmly preset. She even deliberately moved the water glass 6 inches further away than it was during the Kennedy hearing, ensuring that reaching for it would require a highly visible, deliberate motion, meaning she simply wouldn't reach for it at all. Her new armor was highly visible because she had reviewed the film of her first loss and came to the rematch rigidly prepared for every specific attack that had previously worked. But J.D. Vance, sitting at the far end of the dais in a dark suit with no tie and his top button undone, was playing an entirely different game. His color-coded folder, complete with just 5 thin tabs, sat plainly on the desk. He hadn't uttered a word during her opening statement, nor had he taken a single note. His hands just rested palms down on either side of the folder. His expression wasn't one of a man listening to what was being said, but rather someone listening to what was being unconsciously revealed by the speaker. Gently opening the folder, he pulled out a single sheet of paper. He politely thanked her, acknowledging her description of 30 years of public service before offering to describe what 30 years looks like from where he comes from. He reminded her of a 2014 interview she gave to ABC News' Diane Sawyer regarding her post-White House finances, quoting her exactly, "We came out of the White House not only dead broke, but in debt." Placing the printed quote on his desk, he repeated the phrase "dead broke," looking deeply at her, then the committee, and finally the gallery. This wasn't a rehearsed performance. It was a profound act of remembering, visible on his face, not as raw emotion, but as a vast distance, the distance of a man traveling backward in time to a brutal place that nobody else in that room had ever experienced. "Ma'am, I want to tell you what dead broke looks like," he began softly, clarifying that he didn't mean White House dead broke, but rather Middletown dead broke. He painted a visceral picture of sitting at a kitchen table at 11 p.m. in Middletown, Ohio, staring down 2 envelopes, the electric bill and the grocery list. Knowing you can only pay one, you choose the electric bill because it's freezing February and the pipes will burst. Then you check the cabinet to find nothing but canned corn, canned beans, and a brick-sized block of government cheese. You eat that government cheese for dinner because meals depend entirely on whether the adults in the house are functional, and that particular night, they are not. He then recounted finding his grandmother's entire life savings stashed in a size 11 Nike shoebox that used to belong to his stepfather. When she passed away, he counted exactly $412, everything a woman had accumulated after 70 hard years of living. Staring at the quote on his desk, he pointed out that just 3 years after she claimed to be dead broke, she and her husband owned $2.85 million worth of Chappaqua real estate. Her husband was pulling $150,000 per speech, and she had inked a massive $14 million book deal. Vance hammered home the reality. Dead broke doesn't hire a speaking agent, secure a book deal, or buy a secondary house just so the Secret Service can live next door. Real dead broke is a shoebox with $412, a cabinet with government cheese, and a hardworking woman who left this earth with less money than Bill Clinton earns in 9 minutes, standing at a podium. Pulling a second sheet, Vance presented a committee-prepared chart displaying 2 simple lines. It compared her estimated net worth trajectory from 2001 to 2024, skyrocketing from her version of dead broke to $120 million against the median household income in Middletown, Ohio, which painfully crept from $38,000 to just $41,000 over the exact same period. In 23 years, you gained $120 million. In 23 years, Middletown gained $3,000, he stated, setting the chart next to the quote, "He delivered the knockout blow. That's not a comparison, ma'am. That's a diagnosis." Instantly, Clinton's carefully pre-positioned, pre-armored hands, the ones she had locked down specifically to avoid repeating her mistakes from the Kennedy footage, twitched and moved. Her right hand slid over her left, fingers tightly interlocking in a defensive covering rather than a clasp or a prayer. It was the physical gesture of a body desperately seeking to hide both hands, having identified any other position as a critical vulnerability. The grip was incredibly tight, whitening her knuckles just a shade. While the gallery might have missed it, the C-SPAN close-up camera absolutely caught it, signaling to 20 million viewers at home that the armor built to deflect Kennedy's attacks was completely useless against Vance, who was targeting entirely different weaknesses. Flipping to the next tab, Vance pivoted smoothly to the topic of speaking fees. He read from his sheet with the cold precision of a man who already had the numbers memorized, yet chose to read them anyway, because the deliberate act of reading carries more weight than mere recitation. He laid out how, before she became Secretary of State, her husband's going rate was around $150,000 per speech. But magically, during her tenure from 2009 to 2013, those fees skyrocketed to $500,000 in Russia and an eye-watering $750,000 in China. Furthermore, the same organizations paying Bill were also flooding the Clinton Foundation with donations, resulting in at least $26 million flowing from entities that actively had business before her State Department. Pausing to let the math sink in, he calculated out loud $750,000 for one single hour of work. Given that Middletown's median household income was $40,000, Vance pointed out that 1 hour of her husband's time equated to exactly 18 years and 9 months of grinding wages for a family in his hometown. That massive number hung suffocatingly in the hearing room, transforming from raw data into a crushing physical weight. 18 years and 9 months, the room felt it, the gallery felt it, and the C-SPAN audience felt it deeply. It was a convertible number. Every single viewer at home could divide their own annual salary into $750,000, and every personalized result was equally devastating. Now let's talk about who was paying. Vance continued rapidly, listing names without added commentary, letting each entity stand alone. He brought up UBS, noting that after she intervened on their behalf with the IRS, their foundation donations mysteriously ballooned from $60,000 to $600,000, and Bill simultaneously secured $1.5 million in speaking fees. The list went on. Saudi Arabia, Germany, Australia, the United Arab Emirates, and numerous corporations actively pursuing U.S. government contracts. He cited an Associated Press analysis of her State Department calendar, which uncovered that 85 out of the 154 private individuals she met with had pumped a combined $156 million into the Clinton Foundation. Setting that list aside, he picked up a document known as the Grassley Records from December 2025. He detailed how Senator Grassley's investigation exposed that when brave FBI agents tried to probe these shady financial overlaps, the foundation cash, the speaking fees, the State Department favors, they were aggressively blocked. Under the Obama-Biden administration, DOJ leadership repeatedly ran interference, ordering agents to stand down and denying prosecutors crucial support from the Public Integrity Section. He quoted a frustrated EDAR prosecutor directly from the record, citing apparent conflicts of interest within Main Justice leadership regarding the 2016 Clinton probes. Vance then outlined how FBI Deputy Director McCabe actively blocked the foundation's investigative team from touching evidence found on the laptop of Anthony Weiner, the husband of Clinton's top aide, Huma Abedin. The evidence was quickly redirected, and the agents were sidelined. Vance wanted to make absolutely sure the committee grasped the magnitude of what transpired. Her husband's speaking fees quintupled while she ran the State Department. 85 private meeting partners dumped $156 million into her foundation. UBS increased their donations tenfold after a massive favor. And when the FBI finally tried to do their job, they were ordered to halt. While Senator Kennedy had previously called this an architecture of protection, Vance chose a much simpler term. In Middletown, he explained, when someone pays you after you help them with the government, we don't call it a speaking fee. We don't call it philanthropy. We don't call it a foundation donation. We call it a price. He added that when police try to investigate that price and someone commands them to stop, the working class has an entirely different word for that. He didn't even need to say the word aloud. The thick silence of the room supplied it for him. At this exact moment, Clinton's neck began to visibly change color. It wasn't the bright, vivid flush of sudden anger or deep shame, but rather the slow, involuntary warming that occurs when blood rushes to the surface of unprotected skin. Her flawless professional makeup, which had heroically survived Kennedy's 40-minute grilling without a single crack, stopped right at her jawline. Her neck was completely exposed, and unlike a rehearsed facial expression, the neck cannot simply be commanded to maintain a cool color. It forcefully responds to blood pressure, a spiking heart rate, and the autonomic nervous system's raw assessment of a severe threat. This internal alarm operates far below the level of consciousness and simply cannot be overridden, not even by 30 years of meticulous hearing room practice. The resulting flush was a subtle, one-shade warming creeping along the left side of her neck, stretching from her jacket collar up to where her jaw meets her ear. C-SPAN camera 2, which was angled precisely upward from the witness table level, captured this biological betrayal in stunning high definition. It was glaringly visible on any screen larger than a standard phone. And for the 20 million people watching on smaller devices, it registered as a slight, unconscious shift in the image's warmth, the undeniable visual cue that she was experiencing something she desperately wanted to hide. Vance, however, completely ignored the flush. He didn't even glance at her neck as he calmly turned to the next tab. "Ma'am, I want to talk about 33,000 emails," Vance announced, immediately clarifying that he wasn't going to rehash the tired debates over classified info, BleachBit, or the infamous "oh shit" moment. He acknowledged that Senator Kennedy had already covered that ground expertly. Instead, Vance shifted gears to talk about a regular guy named Ray. He didn't even pull a document for this. He spoke purely from memory, the vivid memory of a real place, not a sterile case file. Ray was a forklift driver at a warehouse on Brielle Boulevard in Middletown, a place that used to supply Armco before the steel giant packed up and left. To make ends meet, Ray ran a modest lawn mowing service on the side with 3 employees and 2 riding mowers, keeping his books on a cheap yellow legal pad because he couldn't afford a fancy accountant. When the IRS decided to audit Ray's small business, not for malicious fraud, mind you, but for a simple filing error, Ray panicked and foolishly shredded his financial records. Vance emphasized that these weren't classified documents or top-secret national security chains. They were just receipts for a tiny lawn mowing hustle. The result? Ray was brutally charged with obstruction of a federal investigation, convicted, and slapped with a 14-month sentence in federal prison. His loyal wife had to visit him every single Saturday. His small business completely collapsed upon his release. The warehouse severely cut his hours, and now he's forced to drive for DoorDash just to survive. Vance paused, allowing the heartbreaking weight of Ray's story to permeate the hearing room, sitting there as quietly and permanently as it does in Middletown. It was the tragic tale of a desperate man who destroyed the wrong pieces of paper and paid for it with over a year of his life and his entire livelihood. "Now let me tell you about your papers, ma'am." Vance transitioned sharply. He laid out the timeline. On the 4th of March 2015, the House Select Committee on Benghazi slapped her with a subpoena for her emails. Exactly 3 weeks later, between March 25th and 31st, a Platte River Networks technician deployed a program called BleachBit to permanently eradicate approximately 33,000 emails from her unauthorized private server. These weren't lawn mowing receipts. These chains contained top secret information the absolute highest classification level the U.S. government assigns, including 8 top-secret chains and 36 secret ones. That same technician later confessed to the FBI about having an oh shit moment, realizing he had forgotten to delete them months prior when initially instructed, so he frantically wiped them after the subpoena dropped. Yet, FBI Director Comey simply branded her handling as extremely careless, recommended absolutely 0 charges, and treated her to a highly publicized press conference instead. Looking from Clinton to the committee and back again, Vance laid out the sickening double standard. Wray destroys lawn mowing records and gets 14 months behind bars. Clinton destroys 33,000 subpoenaed emails containing top-secret intelligence and gets a polite press conference. Wray's records dealt with cutting grass, while hers dealt with national security. Wray couldn't afford a public defender, while she could afford elite powerhouse David Kendall. Wray went to federal prison, while she literally went on a lucrative book tour. Vance let these brutal parallels sit heavy in the air, each pair serving as a flawless mirror reflecting a violently biased legal system applying the exact same law to produce wildly different outcomes. And while we're talking about things that cost other people more than they cost you, he continued, bringing up a 2022 incident where her presidential campaign in the DNC casually paid a $113,000 fine to settle an FEC probe. The investigation proved her campaign deliberately misreported spending on opposition research, the very research that spawned the infamous Steele dossier. That fabricated dossier was then weaponized by the FBI to secure FISA surveillance warrants to spy on Carter Page, an American citizen. Vance pointed out that $113,000 was the pathetic penalty for funding bogus research that led to federal surveillance based on allegations that Special Counsel Durham concluded her campaign knew were entirely unsubstantiated. He aggressively did the math. Again, $113,000 is the equivalent of 3 solid years of Wray's warehouse salary. Wray caught 14 months for shredded grass receipts, while she caught a $113,000 fine for funding a dossier used to illegally surveil a U.S. citizen. A fine she swiped her card for like a minor parking ticket before casually moving on. Ma'am, the difference between you and Wray is not the evidence, Vance declared firmly, noting that the evidence against her was far more extensive, meticulously documented, and highly public than anything found in Wray's tiny case file. The difference wasn't the law either, as the law supposedly applies equally to both. The difference is the zip code, he finished. The entire room absorbed that line with the profound silence of pure recognition, the kind of silence reserved for truths so simple and undeniable that they resonate instantly. This wasn't the loud, chaotic silence of shock. Recognition is intensely quiet. It was the sound of 40 million people simultaneously arriving at a conclusion they had long suspected, but had never actually heard spoken aloud in a Senate hearing room by a sitting vice president who happened to grow up in the exact same zip code as Wray. At this point, Clinton's carefully controlled breathing began to visibly unravel. The measured, performance-grade respiratory rhythm she had flawlessly maintained since the gavel dropped the exact breathing exercises she practiced after her previous encounter with Kennedy to prevent cameras from detecting diaphragmatic irregularity fundamentally shifted. The intervals between her inhale and exhale frantically shortened by about half a second. While not audibly gasping or highly visible to the naked eye, the shift was biologically present, manifesting as a slight elevation in her shoulders at the peak of each breath. A tiny, panicked micro pause at the bottom of each exhale emerged that simply wasn't there 5 minutes earlier. Her body was quietly but desperately increasing its oxygen supply because her brain had subconsciously calculated that surviving the next phase of this brutal hearing would demand far more resources than her current breathing rate could physically provide. Her external armor was barely holding on, but the breathing underneath had completely collapsed. Then, Vance turned to the final tab, and the entire room felt the massive shift. It wasn't that Vance's physical movements changed, because they didn't. The shift happened because the folder was now almost entirely empty. leaving just one single tab and one final page. The audience, the committee members, the gallery, and the unblinking cameras had all absorbed 4 distinct stories by now and deeply understood his devastating rhythm. That final tab is exactly where the ultimate question lives. Vance's voice shifted gear, not growing louder or softer, but rather moving much closer in proximity. It was the voice of a man who had stopped reading from a sterile congressional folder and started speaking directly from a worn kitchen table. "Ma'am, I want to tell you about a woman named Mrs. Henderson." He began explaining he wouldn't use her first name because she felt it was too familiar for strangers. And to her, almost everyone was a stranger. Mrs. Henderson had poured 31 grueling years into working the cafeteria line at the Armco steel mill in Middletown. She faithfully served meatloaf on Wednesdays and chicken on Fridays, memorizing every single steel worker by name and affectionately calling each of them honey. Not a single rugged man ever corrected her, because earning a honey from Mrs. Henderson meant she had decided you were genuinely worth feeding, which was the highest compliment imaginable. When Mrs. Henderson finally retired at the age of 74, she did so strictly on a Social Security check of exactly $847 a month. She didn't have a massive global foundation. She didn't command 6-figure speaking fees. She didn't ink a lucrative book deal. And she certainly didn't own sprawling estates in Chappaqua. She lived in a modest 1-bedroom apartment on Corwin Avenue, eating dinner alone at a small kitchen table because her husband passed in 2009 and her kids had fled to Columbus, chasing jobs that no longer existed in Middletown. Vance highlighted the pure nobility of her life. Mrs. Henderson served the public for 31 years, ma'am. She served lunch to the men who built the steel that built this country, and she retired with $847 a month and a kitchen table. Slowly locking eyes with Clinton, he delivered the contrast. "You served the public for 30 years. You traveled to 112 countries. You negotiated with heads of state. You sat in the Situation Room. And you retired with $120 million." He let a highly mathematical pause stretch over the room, giving everyone ample time to compute the terrifying arithmetic. It wasn't the simple math of the numbers that was obvious. It was the arithmetic of the moral comparison that was absolutely devastating. He ruthlessly summarized her spoils: a foundation overflowing with over $2 billion from entities begging for State Department favors, a husband who pocketed over $100 million in fees that conveniently quintupled while she held office, luxurious homes in Chappaqua and D.C., and a daughter residing in a breathtaking $10.5 million Manhattan apartment. Vance reminded her that 3 weeks ago, Senator Kennedy asked who made sure she was never held accountable, and she blatantly refused to answer. He recalled that just a month prior, she endured 6 grueling hours of an Epstein deposition, hiding behind "I don't recall" for a staggering 34% of the questions. And today, I'm not going to ask who protected you. I'm not going to ask what you recall, Vance stated coldly, locking eyes with her, sweeping the gallery, and settling back on her. It was the intense, laser-focused look of a man who was finally about to deliver the very message he came to say, having patiently spent 40 minutes earning the absolute silence that such a profound question requires. He reiterated that Mrs. Henderson retired on $847 a month after serving meatloaf for 31 years, having never traveled to 112 countries, sat in a Situation Room, or launched a global foundation. She served the actual, physical, boots-on-the-ground public and walked away with absolutely nothing. Vance shared his own truth, revealing he grew up surviving off the very meals women like Mrs. Henderson served government lunches, free breakfasts, and canned peaches in heavy syrup. Those meals literally kept him alive during the dark years when his own mother couldn't. To the women slinging food in Middletown cafeterias, it wasn't branded as public service. It was simply called work, and they all retired on meager Social Security checks and nothing else. "Ma'am, my question is simple," Vance pressed. "It is not about emails. It is not about Epstein. It is not about the foundation. It is about arithmetic. In 30 years of public service, you accumulated $120 million. In 30 years in Middletown, my neighbors accumulated nothing. He painted the bleak aftermath. Factories shuttered, children lost to addiction, home values completely wiped out. The public servants, meant to fiercely represent them, got filthy rich, while the working class got completely forgotten. Vance dropped the ultimate hammer. Who were you serving? That question struck the armor like a wrecking ball because her defenses, meticulously pre-calibrated after the Kennedy clash, were designed to deflect questions about partisan systems, immunity architecture, and protective machinery. Her armor was beautifully constructed to absorb institutional attacks and seamlessly redirect them into exhausted 3-minute filibusters about debunked allegations. But Vance's question bypassed the system entirely. It ruthlessly targeted the sickening space between two vastly different human lives. It attacked the horrifying void between a $120 million empire and a $412 shoebox, the chasm between elite Chappaqua and forgotten Corwin Avenue, and the unbridgeable distance between a globe-trotting diplomat and a cafeteria worker scraping by on $847 a month. Her armor possessed absolutely zero defense against arithmetic, because arithmetic doesn't have an angle of attack, a political ideology, or a partisan bias. It is simply two raw numbers placed side by side, leaving the devastating distance between them to tell the entire horrific story. The room plunged into an agonizing 12-second silence, counting off 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 excruciating seconds. Clinton's eyes slowly slid shut. But this wasn't the rapid, fluttering blink of a woman frantically trying to maintain her composure, nor was it the sharp wince of someone absorbing a painful physical blow. It was a deeply deliberate, slow-motion closure that lasted a full 2 seconds, roughly 4 times longer than a standard human blink. It was the extended, system failure blink of a woman whose visual cortex essentially demanded a moment of total darkness, not to hide, but to desperately recalculate without the overwhelming flood of incoming data. She was like a massive supercomputer going completely dark during a hard reboot, shutting down not because it was physically shattered, but because it urgently needed to restart a highly complex program that was catastrophically crashing. When those eyes finally snapped back open, they were physically the exact same color and shape that had defiantly stared down 40 different cameras across 40 intense hearings over 3 decades of scandals. However, the human expression residing behind them had fundamentally shifted. It wasn't dramatically cracked or shattered, but it had severely receded, much like a dark tide pulling away from the shore. The water was still there, still deadly, but it was drastically further away from where it started. The fiery, combative woman who had aggressively entered that room, leaning directly into the fight, who had boldly insulted Vance's resume, openly challenged his authority, and flawlessly performed the arrogant posture of a survivor, had fully retreated to a heavily fortified position further back in her mind. Her face remained technically composed, but that composition was now being artificially maintained from a massive distance, mirroring a defeated general fighting to keep a straight face while ordering a desperate withdrawal from a completely overrun stronghold. Even her high-powered attorney, David Kendall, sat completely paralyzed. His expensive pen remained securely capped, exactly as it had been since the hearing commenced, and his pristine legal pad was completely blank. There was absolutely nothing for him to write down because the question wasn't a complex legal snare. It was pure, unadulterated mathematics. And as any good lawyer knows, mathematics is the one thing you simply cannot defend against in a courtroom. Vance stoically waited out the entire 12 seconds, refusing to rescue her by filling the dead air. He inherently understood in the deep, instinctual way that people from working-class Middletown understand that when you ask a direct question about money and are met with complete silence, that silence is undeniably the answer. The ultra-wealthy are dead silent about their hoarded riches in the exact same way the guilty are totally silent about their violent crimes. It's never because they lack the vocabulary to speak. but because anything they attempt to say will inevitably sound exactly like the disgusting truth it is. Breaking the tension, Vance delivered the final blow. Because from where I grew up, from the kitchen table where I sat as a child wondering if the electricity was going to stay on, it looks like you were serving yourself. He calmly closed his folder, stating that while Mrs. Henderson served meatloaf, Clinton merely served herself, and the staggering $120 million difference was the only answer he needed. He turned to the chairman, stated no further questions, and let the devastation settle. Clinton desperately launched into a 3-minute and 2-second rehearsed diatribe, frantically name-dropping her 30 years of service, her foundation's humanitarian crusades across 40 countries, their clean water initiatives, HIV medication distributions, and massive agricultural developments. She loudly complained about being the most unfairly investigated public figure in American history, without a single charge, leaning heavily on her 112 countries, Situation Room expertise, and the supposedly hyper-partisan timing of the probe right before the 2026 midterms. Her rambling response was perfectly comprehensive, in the same way a massive brick wall is comprehensive. It stubbornly covered every possible angle while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. That wall was incredibly well built, meticulously constructed brick by brick over 30 years using highly tested, ruthlessly refined talking points deployed in countless previous hearings. That formidable wall had survived the flames of Benghazi, the brutal email server investigation, and even the recent Kennedy onslaught, but it completely crumbled under the weight of basic arithmetic. Because while her frantic response championed her foundation's work in 40 countries, it completely omitted the $2 billion in questionable donations and the 85 massive donors who scored exclusive State Department meetings. It highlighted 30 years of glowing public service, but conveniently forgot to mention the $120 million fortune those exact same years mysteriously generated. It paraded HIV medication programs, but was dead silent on the lucrative UBS speaking fees, the shady Saudi donations, and the absurd $750,000 paycheck for a single hour of talking in China. And the audience, those 40 million captivated Americans who had just watched Vance place two simple numbers side by side and let the sickening distance do the talking, heard her glaring omissions infinitely louder, rehearsed words. Because when arithmetic is involved, absolute absence is deafeningly louder than any forced presence. The complete absence of any explanation for that $120 million fortune in a 3-minute speech about selfless public service was the absolute loudest, most damning thing in that entire room. Vance didn't even flinch or react. He was already busy packing up his thin, color-coded folder. It was the quiet folder of a man who didn't come to spin fanciful political stories, but simply arrived to read the hard numbers. He stood up, sharply buttoned his jacket, gave a respectful nod to the chairman, and walked out without ever looking back at Clinton. He had spent his allotted 40 minutes staring deeply at her numbers, allowing the math to do all the heavy lifting. He was simply the messenger holding the paper. The internet immediately exploded, and the first clip to shatter the algorithm wasn't the dead broke quip, the price monologue, or even the two justice systems breakdown. It was the raw math. The full, uncut sequence journeying from the staggering $120 million fortune straight through Mrs. Henderson, retired with $847 a month, culminating in the brutal "who were you serving?" and ending on those agonizing 12 seconds of silence and the extended system failure blink. That perfectly condensed 2-9-second clip was shared an unfathomable 34 million times in the first 18 hours alone. It required absolutely zero punditry or talking heads. The numbers were the ultimate, undeniable commentary. The second clip to completely break the internet was the zip code comparison. Watching Vance expertly contrast Ray's soul-crushing 4-month federal prison sentence with Clinton's polite press conference, ending on the haunting phrase, "the difference is the zip code," triggered an unprecedented digital phenomenon. This specific clip traveled unlike anything else in the series, wildly infiltrating left-wing criminal justice reform circles, landing on the feeds of defense attorneys, exhausted public defenders, Innocence Project champions, and passionate bail reform advocates simultaneously. It was catching absolute fire across hardcore MAGA communities on the right. For the very first time, a single political clip was being aggressively shared with equal fiery enthusiasm by violently opposed factions who disagreed on literally everything else, yet completely united on one sickening conclusion: two entirely different justice systems absolutely existed. The zip code truly was the only deciding factor. As Ray rotted in a cell while Clinton embarked on a glitzy book tour, the progressive left branded it as systemic inequality, while the conservative right slammed it as the corrupt deep state swamp. But they were furiously describing the exact same horrific reality. It reached such a fever pitch that even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez retweeted the zip code clip on X without adding a single word of commentary. The intense irony of a fierce progressive congresswoman openly amplifying a hardcore conservative vice president's surgical attack on her own party's biggest icon was glaringly obvious to everyone online except, apparently, to AOC herself. She shared it because the core attack was fundamentally about class warfare, and class disparity is the one universal language capable of completely obliterating rigid party lines. Exactly 48 hours later, panicked staffers quietly scrubbed the post from AOC's timeline. But the internet is forever. Millions of screenshots had already flooded every dark corner of the web, and those deleted screenshots were arguably far more powerful than the original post because they proved unequivocally that Vance's mathematical argument had penetrated a cultural layer where blind political identity could no longer contain or defend against it. Hillary Clinton's legendary Teflon armor didn't just crack it completely shattered. Within 72 hours of the explosive hearing, Attorney General Kash Patel's DOJ upgraded a routine review into a full-blown criminal investigation into the Clinton Foundation. For the first time in 30 years, the government wasn't just reviewing old probes. They were aggressively hunting for criminal conduct, rapidly blasting out federal grand jury subpoenas to top financial officers. Panic immediately ripped through the foundation's board, forcing an emergency suspension of all international operations. The writing was on the wall. 3 massive institutional megadonors privately threatened to pull their funding, and banking giant UBS publicly distanced itself. Things turned so toxic that the foundation's own CFO hired independent legal counsel, the ultimate signal in federal probes that an insider is desperately preparing to cooperate with the feds. The structural fallout was catastrophic and irreversible. Bill Clinton's lucrative speaking empire collapsed overnight, plummeting 91%, as corporate boards, terrified of being accused of buying political access, suddenly canceled bookings. Even Chelsea Clinton's upcoming book tour was indefinitely shelved. The fatal blow came when a bipartisan Senate committee slapped the Clintons with a devastating RICO referral, while the State Department permanently stripped Hillary of her elite security clearance. When Politico reached out to J.D. Vance for a comment, he coldly replied with just 4 words. The arithmetic is public. He didn't need to spin the story. In working-class towns like Middletown, locals like Crystal Atkins understood exactly what happened. They know the brutal math of poverty, instantly recognizing the sickening, unbridgeable gap between a struggling grandmother's $412 shoebox savings and a politician's $120 million elite fortune. This wasn't just another partisan spat. It was the absolute triumph of cold, hard numbers over 30 years of empty Washington rhetoric. As a Louisiana bait shop owner perfectly summarized, Kennedy asked who protected her. Vance asked who she served. Now, with a federal grand jury convened, a global foundation paralyzed, and a historic RICO referral in play, only one terrifying question remains. Will the panicked political establishment try to destroy J.D. Vance before the grand jury finishes reading the receipts? Smash that like button, subscribe, and stay tuned, because this political war has only just begun.